and we'll get started.
Yay!
Yay! Well, I'm so pleased to have Lexi Kent-Monning on Comp Title Book Club with me tonight. If I can very briefly introduce you.
Absolutely.
So, Lexi Kent-Monning is an alumna of the Tyrant Books workshop Mors Tua Vita Mea in Sezze Romano, Italy, taught by Giancarlo Di Trapano and Chelsea Hodson. I'm already getting a little emotional. Okay. Lexi's writing has been published or is forthcoming in X-Ray, Joyland, Tilted House Review, Neutral Spaces, Little Engines, and elsewhere. A native Californian, she now lives in Brooklyn, New York. Lexi's debut novel, The Burden of Joy, which we will be talking about today, is available through Rejection Letters. Lexi, welcome to Comp Title Book Club.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm so stoked to do this. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. I'm stoked too. And also, like, I have to say that in addition to just, sort of being in the same satellite of writers, your work strikes this balance between style and substance that for me, as an intelligent woman who has written two rom-coms, I really appreciate. And
Thank you.
like your recent short piece for Black Lipstick, which like is under the guise of a listicle about mascara reviews, but then is about so much more. I won't give it away. You should go over to Black Lipstick on Substack and read it if you haven't. Just like genius things you're doing with form and with this like understated humor that I think is feminine or femme in a way, you know?
Thank you. Oh my God, that means so much to me. Thank you. And like I'm constantly I often feel like I'm way more style than substance. So this is like very reassuring to hear.
To be fair, I really love playing around with form, so maybe it's just our own intrinsic biases pinging off of one
True.
another. Who knows? But I would love to also tell folks who haven't had the pleasure of reading The Burden of Joy yet. So that is Lexi's debut novel. We're going to be talking about it through the lens of another book, Maggie Nelson's Bluets. Um, which I, yes. Oh my gosh, she's like, I've got notes. I
I
took
sure
notes like
do.
a bookstagram girly. Um, but first, let me just tell you a little bit about the novel we'll be discussing within the lens of Maggie Nelson, because it also is killer. This is just from the Rejection Letters jacket copy. I can't improve on what they said. So, in addition to being a Nylon magazine must-read and a Volume 1 Brooklyn Book of the Month, Lexi Kent-Monning's debut novel, The Burden of Joy, is an incessant dagger to the heart. After Lexi's husband leaves her on Valentine's Day to join a commune that time forgot, her home stops belonging to her. Instead, she discovers a parade of dead animals, a man who turns her blue eyes green, true love in equal parts cocaine and MDMA, and a revolving door of solitude. In the end, Lexi must ask herself, is her craving to nurture virtuous or hedonistic? And this novel has gotten so many great blurbs, but the one you have posted on your website, which I, as a Death Cab for Cutie fan, really appreciate, is from Ben Gibbard. And it says, never before has the wreckage of a failed marriage been more brutally and bloodily documented. The candidness with which Lexi writes about this terrible time in her life is a thing of dark beauty. The Burden of Joy is truly an incredibly brave piece of work.
Yay.
Um, would you mind? Would it be okay? Would you be on the spot if I asked you to read like a little bit of your novel?
No, I'd be happy to. If
Please
that's all
do.
right.
Please
Okay.
do.
I chose a little passage that has blue in it to be on theme.
Very thematic, very on brand
And
for
I'm
tonight.
wearing blue. This is all I'm very basic in certain ways. And one of those is I love a theme. So
Yes. Oh my gosh. Same.
so this one is like this is called Eurydice. They're all short chapters in this book. And this is like 3 pages. But it has blue, and I think it's like a good like hint into what the rest of the book is like. So, okay. Eurydice. The Guggenheim is installing a new exhibit and the rotunda is closed. I don't think I would have even noticed, and probably would have tripped through the caution tape roping it off, had the security guard not told me as I entered. I later find my ticket. I was charged half price for the inconvenience. There must have been a discussion about this. I must have chatted with the cashier, walked up a set of stairs. Instead, I suddenly come into consciousness staring into a cornflower blue painting of Orpheus, drowned, his head and hair floating atop his lyre. I've wandered an exhibit filled with paintings of myths, mysticism, religion, hedonism, hung against red walls, cloaked in navy velvet curtains and couches, a replica and homage to an annual salon in Paris in the 1800s. The colors, textures, and themes are in unabashed harmony with my night under Leo's grasp. I'm mercifully free of thought, and instead full of senses and instincts. I touch the velvet couches, inhale my unwashed hair, Leo still emanating from it. I let the blue of The Death of Orpheus by Jean Delville penetrate my eyes until they throb and tear. I tongue at a teardrop, savoring my own salt. I think of my friend Jesse, who licks paintings in museums, a compulsion he hasn't been able to break. But I don't need to lick the painting. It already resides on my tongue, waking up taste bud by taste bud, the longer I bore my eyes into it. My lips wet, my eyes overcome, I move to a couch to breathe in the scent of Leo in my hair and revel. At this moment, I realize I'm returning to the living. I'm Eurydice, and I'm here to tell you that Orpheus brought me back from the dead. I see a young girl around 7 years old, crouching in front of a painting, enraptured by the glowing halo of the young woman who is its subject, the sheep at her side staring up at her, the blue mountain and low-lying fog, the yellowing grass. The girl kneels in front of the painting for 10 minutes, almost in a bow. I don't move until she does, reluctantly, and only at her father's insistence. This painted shepherdess would be Leo's and my daughter. The sheep would be our pets. Our children would certainly have halos. I'm Eurydice, and Orpheus and I revive each other with music, blue paintings, red walls, velvet couches, and the fog and mountain envelop us under our children's halos. Only later do I realize I've forgotten the part of the myth where Eurydice dies again if Orpheus looks at her. The colors restoring themselves into my vision are primary. I see blues and reds. I live within them. They live within me. My blue eyes and red blood. They're cast under the yellow of Leo with his wild hair that makes his beaming face resemble the sun, rays of light blazing from it. He walked towards me on the rooftop during magic hour, shooting golden light back at the sun. Like opening a door to the daylight from a dark room, the unrelenting brightness sparked the floaters in my eyes into confetti, scattering and dancing in my vision. The primary colors have been restored first in the natural order of things. Next will be greens and purples and oranges. Slowly, slowly, I beg. Let me see in primary colors, in threes, just until my eyes adjust. As I walk through Central Park after the museum, the wind against my face chills where the tears streak down to my mouth. I imagine blue cornflower paint dripping from my eye to my lips, and that every stranger I walk by can see it. When I reach the other side of the park and catch my reflection in a shop window, I'm stunned to see no visible streak of blue. There's no tell on my exterior. How will they all know that I've been resurrected?
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Of course.
It had been a while since I'd read Maggie Nelson, and so to have you reread that chapter of The Burden of Joy in the context of what I have been reading more recently, and see those homages peeking out, like the cornflower blue, everything like that. God, this is one of my favorite things about craft, because also just Leo being the sun, and just thinking about the Apollo's role in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Like I promise I'm about to like stop just like bombing you with like a lot of praise. I know some people are uncomfortable with that. I hope you're not, because
Bring it on.
Good. You've worked for this, you deserve this. But yeah, just a lot of times I think under a lesser pen, you would have this scene and it would be beautiful. It would be a lovely vignette of a day at an art museum after you've slept with a new partner and things are new and magical. But you have this knack for just like those tiny little twists of the knife that add a plot into it. Like, only later do I realize, that twist of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, that it isn't this happily ever after, you guys.
Exactly.
God, thank you, Lexi. Thank you for reading.
Thank you.
So I'm excited to get into talking about Maggie Nelson with you. And so I wanted to start just kind of with a softball, which is how did you first come across Blue, which is how I've been pronouncing it. Of course, like it's been a while since I've talked with anyone, so I'm going to be highly embarrassed if you're like, well, Bluets.
Okay, this is part of what I was curious about because I've heard people say it all different ways. And like even in the book, she
Mhm.
says something like mispronouncing it, and that like you're supposed to say it blue, but that she says like bluets or something. In my head, it's always bluets, but I don't know if I've ever had to say it out loud until right
I'm
now.
I'm also very like okay, same wavelength. I was Googling, like I listened to a YouTube thing of like American English how to pronounce Blue. And for the longest, I was like, okay, so I'm gonna say Bluets. And then I got to I've been calling her propositions koans because they remind me of like the
Mm.
Buddhist koan, even if they're a bit long for one. Um, I got to the one where she's talking about Blue Isle, like the oh gosh, I was just reading it this morning. There's a section where she pronounces it Blue, in fact. She
Yeah,
says like the flower, Blue. And
yeah.
now I'm
There's a
just
whole
worried I'm going to
section where
sound like
she's
a
like,
Valley girl saying the name of the kids' TV show. So, anyway, when did you
it's up
first
for
come across
interpretation. Oh, sorry.
when did you first come across Bluets, Blue, however you would like to pronounce it,
The
and I'll
B
take your
word.
lead.
I'm going to say it differently every time. No, just
Oh,
kidding.
okay. I'll keep me on my toes.
I was trying to remember. So I first read this in 2017. And I do not remember where I found it. It was funny because it was 2017 was when I was first really coming across more like indie lit, and so was starting to learn more about books like this that are like kind of off the beaten path, or yeah, just kind of like so different with form.
Mhm.
And so I don't remember where I first heard about it, but I remember I was living close to Big Sur. I was living in the Carmel Highlands where I wrote most of this book. And I read it there, and it just like completely blew me away. And I mean, it changed everything for me. It was like really like a life altering experience to read this book. And the funny thing is, I read it twice then, and I haven't read it since then until last night. I reread it last night for the
Oh
first
wow.
time since
In one fell
2017.
swoop.
Yeah, I do that. And like, I don't know if that's bad, but I really like binging books because I realize like I forget stuff so much that I have to go back to reread things anyway. So I just do better if I just read things in one sitting. And
Right.
that sitting could be like 18 hours, but like
Wow.
so yeah, I don't remember where I first came to it. But that was definitely a time when I was like seeking out kind of more off the beaten path writing. Of course, now this has gone on to be huge, or maybe like just in our world, it's huge. I have no
Yeah.
concept of like how big it actually is.
It's funny because my path was it sounds like you came to indie lit a bit later in your writing life as well. Um and being a trade publishing girly, like that's how I started out. I knew Maggie Nelson more so for her later successes, The Argonauts and et cetera, et cetera. And so the first time I think I heard of Blue A's was on the porch at Morse to Evita Mea. One of my cohort was praising it effusively, and I was like, oh gosh, I need to read this.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was, and actually the weird thing is that was 2017 for me, the
Oh
fall of
wow.
2017. So maybe that was just a magic year for this book.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like she's always been there.
Right, right.
And so you said you read it a couple of times that year and then not again until literally last night.
Mhm.
So perhaps that answers my question, but how, if at all, do you feel that Nelson's work has inspired yours, specifically this debut novel, The Burden of Joy? Like, was it a conscious comparative title you were writing towards during the drafting and editing process, or did that sort of evolve over editing and production as you were looking for ways to describe it to potential agents and publishers?
So it was a couple of things. First, it was kind of more subconscious. It really like the biggest influence it had on me was kind of seeing how weird you could get with writing, with form, with creativity. I initially wrote The Burden of Joy as just straight memoir, so it was quite different. And this book, Blue Ways, Bluets, it kind of like gave me I don't know, it opened doors for me into seeing like, oh, you can get pretty weird, and like you can get like I write short pieces way better than anything long, which is why my book is just like a bunch of really short vignettes and chapters. That's just how I write better. I could not write something longer if I tried. So seeing that she could make a whole book like that, I was like, oh, I didn't even know that was possible. And then kind of how much interiority there is too, and how much she trusted the reader with interiority. I was so anxious with The Burden of Joy, especially in the first few drafts, that it was like it should just be my journals and nobody should ever see it. And so seeing the way she writes about personal stuff and like her interior thinking made me kind of like have to think of it that way of like, okay, how can I engage an audience and trust them with interiority, and how can I be like a friendly writer in that way? And I think one of those things is making the short chapters. I've had a lot of friends, like especially with kids, be like, oh my god, your book was so easy to read. And like to me that's actually a huge compliment. Like I
Yeah.
know some writers where they don't think that's a compliment, but I was like, oh no, I love that.
Right. And I mean, for something being short, I mean, when I was rereading Blue, there were a couple of different propositions that she has where I had to go back and read it a few times because I'm like, wait, what is the logic train here? Or and I want to get back to what you were saying about interiority later on in our conversation. But one thing I think is important to discuss, especially for folks who are new to hopefully not at this point, but newer to the concept of what can often be called autofiction. I'd like to talk about the distinction between your book and Maggie Nelson's. So Bluets is billed as an essay collection, whereas The Burden of Joy is marketed as a novel, which presumes that the quote unquote I in Bluets is Maggie Nelson, or Maggie Nelson as writer. And then the Lexi in The Burden of Joy is a fictional character, or at the very least, a fictionalized version of the writer. So I would love if you have anything that you'd like to talk about with the decision in it sounds like the first draft was a memoir and then you switched to, okay, I'm going to change it into a work of fiction here. What the thought process was there.
Yeah, so it's funny that actually that switch came quite a bit later. It actually I sold it as a memoir and then changed it with my publisher and decided to change it to a novel. So that was a big restructure. But it was really helpful for me because I felt when I was writing it as a memoir and selling it as that and like editing it as such, I felt kind of boxed in by what had to be truthful and like and what was going to be like, I don't know, not that it would ever be fact checked because it's on an indie press, but like I felt like I had to be really true to everything as exactly as it happened. Once I started thinking of it as the possibility of a novel, and that came up because of Jeff Rickley, whose book Someone Who Isn't Me is out on Rose Books.
It's incredible. I think we're preaching to a home choir, but
I think so too.
the podcast listeners might not know about this, so please go check out Jeff Rickley's Someone Who Isn't Me by Rose Books.
Yeah. So he's a friend of mine and we got coffee it was in last winter. I don't remember if it was last year or the beginning of this year. And he was talking to me about his book and like memoir versus novel. And I think he had gone to a class at the 92nd Street Y where I think it was a nonfiction class, and his teacher was like, I think you should actually change this to fiction. I might be wrong about some of those details, but so I talked to him about that and I was like, well, how do you do that? Like, isn't it hard to change it into a novel? Because you have to make like, do the typical story arc and like all this kind of stuff. But I just couldn't stop thinking about it after I talked with him about it. And it ended up really making me feel liberated as a writer because I didn't feel like I had to be such a reporter. I felt like I could get more creative. I had more, there was more, I could kind of fudge timelines. I could like mix characters together to like prove a point, stuff like that. It made certain characters way more impactful, and definitely made like a character arc out of my character, the narrator, where like some of those things happened way before or way after. So it was stuff that I could really turn into an actual story instead of just feeling like I had to be a very true reporter. And I think also as time went on, and like, this stuff all happened in my real life, but as time went on, it felt so much more like a character. I didn't relate to that part of my life anymore, which is awesome because it
Yeah.
sucked.
Yeah.
So as time went on, and it was like years and years later, I just kind of felt like I related to it less and less. And so being able to take liberties with a character versus kind of saying like, this is my story, was just really helpful overall.
I think there's a part in Blue where she says something about, being afraid to write about certain things because, is it the memory of the thing or the way that you process and write down the thing? But for you, it sounds like that was a healthy process, creative writing as working through tool rather than
Absolutely.
rather than, oh
Yes.
no, I'm going to lose this memory that hurts me, but also that I want to keep hurting me.
Right.
Which
Yes,
seems to be sort of
exactly.
the ethos of Blue to a certain extent.
Definitely. Yeah.
And also, so for the most part, The Burden of Joy is written in this third person perspective, close to Lexi's perspective. But there's this gorgeous shift, probably one of my favorite parts of the novel in one of the final chapters, Return, where it shifts to a second person narrator. Um, and it calls to the reader, or rather a specific you, that the reader is sitting there wondering like whose identity this might be, to come back, almost like, to me it read almost like an ode to a muse that you'd see more often at the start of a project. And so I have to know what informed this shift. It's a really fun, speaking of form, it's a really fun bit of formal play to almost end the book on, and I'd love to hear more about the creative process that went into it.
Yeah. So I love that chapter. That's my favorite one in the whole book. So thank you so much for loving it too. Oh, hello, Ellie.
Yeah.
Thank you for noticing that chapter because I love it. And I think because it's towards the end, sometimes I don't know, I'm like, I hope people pay attention to it. But I love that chapter partially because it was a huge surprise to me to write it. It was one of those times when you're like, I don't know where this is coming from. This is just coming out of me. And it
Just
was
like
like,
flowing.
yeah, exactly. And it was so weird because I was doing Jamie Attenberg's A Thousand Words of Summer. So it's
Mm,
like a 2 week sprint where you write 1,000 words a day, and she sends like these great newsletters every morning, like a pep talk, and has other writers write them. So I've done that for maybe 3 or 4 times. And I was doing it like I knew what scenes I wanted to write in this book. I just had a list of them, and I was like, maybe doing 1,000 words of summer for 2 weeks would be a really good way to just like get a bunch of these done. So I was
mm.
waking up at 5 in the morning and like just writing. I would like not even put on my glasses. I'm like super, I can't see shit. So I wouldn't put my glasses on. I would like sleep with my laptop next to me, which I never usually do. And I would just open it and start writing right away. And it was like such a weird experience because I would go back and read stuff later and be like, who wrote this? Like, I don't know where it came from. I had no memory of some of the stuff that I was writing because I would go back to sleep after I was done with my 1,000 words.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very surreal experience. But the return chapter, it kind of just poured out of me. And that was a chapter that was pretty true to the first draft. I didn't really change much about it. The only thing I changed was like I once I decided to make it into a novel, I just changed some of the things in that chapter that wouldn't be directly towards one of the two men in the book, Leo or Daniel. And it
Mm.
kind of just like I just worked with it a little bit to make sure like each theme kind of stuck. But yeah, and I love your question about how it's at the end instead of the beginning, because like the story arc is that you think the narrator is maybe getting somewhere emotionally, and then you're like, oh no. Like you get to that chapter and you're like, oh no, she's still on her shit.
Aw. Which, is realistic. I mean, I feel like
Yeah,
growth is often less of like group and more like, okay, well, we're going to spiral and then we're going to go up the spiral. And yeah.
totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it felt more true to life to me to have it like, yeah. And I've definitely had that experience with grief and stuff like that, where you think it's like 2 steps forward, wait, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Yeah, it's like you think that you're progressing, and then you're like, wait, why do I feel so bad about this again today? And
Yep. Yep. Oh my gosh. Yeah, definitely one of my favorite passages of your book. And
thank
I feel like
you.
maybe one of the passages that will become like most tattooed, if like there's
Oh
a
my
most
god.
tattooed section of your book.
That's hilarious. Oh my god. People, please don't do it.
All right, so we've got a couple of folks who are watching live. One of the best things about attending Comp Title Book Club live is that you can ask any questions that you have. I see that you guys are being shy. Don't be shy. Lexi's very nice to talk to. I can vouch. um, so, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in there. And I'll keep checking intermittently throughout. Um, but I do so hanging on to Return for a second because
Yeah.
it's in this dreamlike surreal state. And then but also, I mean, this novel has a fascinating hook about the emotional weight that nurturers and people pleasers undertake. And in fact, Return ends with three highly relatable and honestly kind of hilarious paragraphs. They're short and they read, "Come back to me, or I can come to you, whichever is easier for you."
I'm so glad you think that's funny because I think it's funny.
Yeah, and people are probably like, "Oh no, oh honey," but like that's how it is. I don't think I've ever like I have to coach myself if I'm saying something to not be like, "Sorry, I was just like, what am I apologizing for?" Um And I remember reaching out to you on Instagram when I finished my arc of the novel and going, I related so hard to Lexi as narrator. I feel nurtured and like I'm a nurturer and never get nurtured. And you were like, yay, but also, oh no.
I've
But
been finding myself saying that to a lot of folks. I'm like, I'm really sorry this resonates with you.
well, like I get that, but also, like strong fiction draws from the writer's life, but I always believe strikes that resonant chord with the reader. So is this just a happy accident that you feel has started to happen now that you're taking your show on the road? Like, did you expect people to resonate with Lexi's journey of like carrying this burden of joy?
I kind of hoped for it and hoped against it because I know how hard it is to be in that position of, always nurturing and people pleasing. And it's taken so much therapy for me to get better at it. And I'm still constantly practicing it. But I had a feeling, and even just like chatting with friends and stuff, I had a feeling that it would hit for people. And I think I also felt like when I was writing it, I thought the idea of like someone being a nurturer and a hedonist and like seeing those things tied together was just so weird. And like when I realized that about myself, I was like, there's got to be someone else out there who feels this way too. And like
Yes.
maybe I can find them if I write about it.
You've got this little tribe of
Yes.
people.
Who
My
like
guess,
get a total hit from like taking care of people. It's like,
yes, total hit from taking care of people, but then also like I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm a resentful people pleaser.
oh,
Like
me too. Yeah, I go in total cycles about it. Yeah.
yeah, and then you're just like you're hedonistic in a more selfish way. Like this is my time to do with as I please, so I'm going to be reckless with it.
Yes.
Um
Oh my God, totally.
yeah.
Yes. Hmm.
I get it. I thank you for writing this book specifically for me. That's how it feels. Yeah, no, so okay, I've fangirled about The Burden of Joy. I do want to start talking a bit more about about Blue in the and your novel in the context of it. And you've mentioned the two men that are in Lexi's life in this novel. There's Daniel, who is her husband, who breaks up with her on Valentine's Day to go run a commune in Big Sur. A job, by the way, that the nurturer Lexi got for him in the first place. Just gonna say that. And then Leo, who seems like he's a panacea to what she's left behind. Um, there are two passages. Let's see if I can do this sort of hand yoga with my microphone in my book.
That is
Uh,
something I've had to practice doing readings. I'm like, I've never held a microphone before, and now I have to hold a book at the same time.
oh my gosh,
It's a tricky balance.
it's like when you want a 2002 Britney Spears headset, like just so you can be hands
So
free.
true. So true.
So there's these two sections, number 38 and number 44. Number 38 is about the way that we just see, an ugly orange flower, where a honeybee sees the gaping violet mouth of the folds of a poppy. And then not even two pages later in number 44, um, Maggie Nelson's therapist says to her, she is trying to get me to see that although I thought I loved this man very completely for exactly who he was, I was in fact blind to the man he actually was or is. And I just thought, especially, there's this section in The Burden of Joy where Lexi realizes how the two men in her life have perceived her and have different interpretations of her, just in the same way that her perception and interpretation of them may be different, number one, from what they want to project to the world, and number two, may have changed over time. And this is a really resonant theme in Maggie Nelson. She even goes on with there's the tribe in the desert, the Tuareg, which that name translates to like godless ones, but they're like, yeah, no, we call ourselves the free people. And I love this feels fresh to me. You know, it's not something that we get very often in fiction these days. I feel like a lot of times our characters are so convicted of their dreams and their ideas, even if they're like insane, because we have so much first person and close third going on. So I was just wondering, well, you said it was memoir at first. Let's focus on the drafting process where it had become a novel. Um, was the section on perception an early part of The Burden of Joy, or was it added later on after you had had time to deepen your thoughts about the book?
It was very different early on, but it was always present. And I think when thinking of Maggie Nelson and the influence of Bluets on The Burden of Joy, definitely the way that she embraces ambiguity and the way that she lets herself change her mind about other people, I think was another thing that was really eye-opening to me. You didn't have to be so convicted about something. You didn't have to stick with seeing a person as they always were or portraying them as such as a character, including as the narrator. And so I found that, I don't know, it's funny because as a reader, if I watch a movie or TV or something, I used to get really irritated by ambiguity. And as I've gotten older, I think I've embraced it a lot more. And then I found as I was writing, I felt almost protective of those two characters, of Leo and Daniel. And it's been so funny because I've definitely had people reacting strongly to both of those characters in ways where I'm like, no, but they're actually good guys. And I'm like, oh no, I'm doing it again. But that's one thing that I just love so much about Maggie Nelson, the way she talks about a past love is, you know, there's a mix of acknowledging like the beautiful moments, and there's like some scenes that are so loving, and then there's other scenes, you know, where he never opens the letter, and like she's like, well, I gave it to you not as like a talisman, I gave it to you because I had something to say.
Yeah, and yet he carried it around for months unopened. Like, talk about a
Yes.
metaphor.
Oh my God, totally. And so I really loved that. It's like I felt like she was actually being quite objective. And it's funny to me too, because even when I'm talking to friends or something about a guy I'm dating or whatever it is, and like about my husband at the time, I feel like a lot of people do this where they kind of self-censor what they're sharing with their friends, and there's like, you know, you don't really share the crappy parts that often. I mean, if something is like a really big deal, you will, but like just the small daily shitty stuff,
Yeah.
maybe not daily, but you know, the stuff that's
Yeah.
not great, like you don't necessarily share that with people. And so I just found it so refreshing at the time that I read Bluets to read like, oh, it wasn't some grand love story. It was like, oh, there were also things that were irritating, or, you know, like in the beginning when they're having sex in the Chelsea Hotel and she says it's the only time she came. And I was like,
Yes.
that's so great. Like, I'm sure she never said that while it was happening. Like
Right.
her friends probably didn't know that during that relationship.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And that's the scene where she looks out and she sees the blue tarp flickering on the wind. And I'm like, oh, wow, you know, like you came, but also one of the things you most remember about that day is a tarp you saw outside. So,
Yes, I love
yeah.
that. I love the mix of like the quotidian and the like remarkable. I just
Yeah.
think
The
that's like,
sublime. Yeah.
yeah, it's so, I love the way she does that. It's so funny. Like, of all things to notice. And like, I'm sure anybody who's read it, like now I notice every blue tarp I ever see and think of
Yes.
her.
Yeah. You're never going to look at a blue tarp the same way again.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that one reason that it is like that is just, well, hold on. let me see if I can find, is that actually my note number? I think it must be 47. I've got 347, but I know for a fact it wasn't that far back in the book. And I don't even know if it goes up that far. I'm honestly, my mind's a
I
blur
know,
right
me
now.
too. I was actually meant to see how many there were and I forgot to like mentally note that. Let's see.
So I am not sure what exactly past Jessica. I think past Jessica thought, well, this is your problem, not mine.
Oh, I do that a
Oh,
lot.
oh, past Jessica, what are you doing to me? Well, what I did want to say though, and I wanted to give an example, sorry, Maggie Nelson, but truly, most of her sentences feel like, well, some backstory. Um, our former mentor, to whom in part your book is dedicated, Giancarlo Di Trapano, when he co-led the Mors Tua Vita Mea workshop, each cycle that happened of it, there was one particular morning session where you'd go and he'd have his little chalkboard and you had the one sentence test, the one line test, where we were told the night before, like, come up with a sentence. It doesn't matter. It can be flashy, it can be quotidian, it can be whatever. And we're going to lovingly pick it apart to really, like, economy of language. Like, do you really need everything that you've said here? And I do really feel like a lot of these sentences um, would with very few notes pass the one line test. And I also felt that way about your novel. And so I won. Yes, no,
Oh my God.
take it,
Thank
take
you.
the compliment. You're very welcome.
God, that's a hard one to take, but I thank you very much.
Well, that's how I felt reading it, just like having a delight on a sentence level. And so I was curious from a craft perspective what your approach is to crafting a well gusseted sentence. Is it in the drafting, or like my approach is more to like chisel away at it when I'm in the editing process.
Yeah, I definitely am more of a chiseler as well in the editing process, but like sometimes you just get lucky and just get one and it just surfaces to your brain and you're like, yes, So some of them, the first sentence of The Burden of Joy was one that Giancarlo loved, and it was actually later in the book, and he loved it so much that I made it the first sentence, and it is, my sinuses can still feel when my ex-husband has had a bad night's sleep. And he loved
So
that
good.
sentence. Thank you. He loved it, and so I decided to move it up. And also the previous first sentence through many drafts was when Lexi's earring comes off in Leo's mouth.
Mm,
And I still love that sentence, but that whole chunk just needed to be moved way later into the story.
yeah.
So when I realized I needed to restructure the timeline, that I was like, I think the sinuses, I think that's got to be it. And that sentence just came to me. That was one of those lucky ones. But otherwise, I'm very much like a chisel away kind of person.
Yeah.
And this book, it ended up being like, it's like 40,000 words, I think. And it started at like 75 and then 60. And then like, I just kept,
Yeah.
each draft got shorter and shorter.
Wow. And honestly, I have to say, thank God for like indie presses like Rejection Letters, because anyone who's listening to this, who's more on like the trade side of things, is like, oh my God, 40,000 words. Like, how did you sell that? Like all of that,
Right.
because they get so focused on that word count. I,
Exactly. I was
I
actually explaining that to my parents last night. I was on the phone with my parents and saying that about, I was like, this is why I'm so glad I have an indie press, or like that I'm on an indie press, is because they let me put out a really short word count book. And like, oh, this is because my mom just read something, and I don't want to talk shit, so I'm not going to say what it was, but she read
okay.
something where she was like, the writing is good, but like, it definitely felt bloated. And she was wondering if like it was a word count situation. And I was like, and it was on a major, and I was like, it could have been, because
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh yeah. We'll have to have an off-camera talk about all of this. I have several theories about things like that. But yeah, no, I like, thank goodness that they were like, hey, we trust you to make this the like most emotionally incisive and like to the heart. I don't think it would be, as your publisher describes it, a dagger to the heart if you had kept it at 70,000 words.
I totally agree. And it's so funny because going back to look, I looked at some of the early drafts, like the week it came out. I pulled all the physical. I didn't print every draft, but I printed a lot of them. And so I have like 7 or 8 previous drafts like printed out, and I'd like hauled them all out of my closet and like put them all next to each other. And it's funny how they get smaller over time, but it was also funny because I would open to a random page in the first draft and be like, oh my God, like this sentence I was so wed to, and then like it's not there anymore, and I don't see how I ever saw value in this sentence. It was such filler, you know.
Yeah, this is what they mean by kill your darlings. Most of the time it's actually worth it, but
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard, like it's hard to see it clearly. For me, the way that I do that is like I have to not look at it for a few months. And that's hard for me because I want to constantly be tinkering, but I just get so much clarity when I have some time away from it. When I come back, it's so clear to me, like, oh, this sentence can go. Like, I can't believe I was so into this sentence.
yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's hard. It takes practice to step away like that. Do you fill your time with other things when you're taking that step away, like shorter pieces?
That's exactly what I do. Yeah, always working on shorter pieces. Because also then you can submit those and get like a nice dopamine hit if they get accepted.
Yes.
Or just feel bad about yourself when they get rejected. But you know, it's all part of it. But
Yes.
yeah, it was like because I was working on this for such a long time, and like I started to get I like first of all just needed something else to fill my head for a while when I was taking those breaks. But then I also, I mean, it's all just short pieces in the book. It's just book length. So I'm always writing little things. So yeah, I find that really helpful too. And I think that also helps me with brevity. And, you know, with Maggie Nelson, it was like seeing how she could compose this whole book of these small little like things that just hit so hard. I was like, I think the conservation of words I really appreciated from her, and saw like how beneficial that could be. I actually wonder how many words this is. I mean, it's only like 100 pages.
It's a very slim volume. For
Yeah.
people who are watching on video, for people who aren't watching on video, I'm holding up Maggie Nelson's book, and it's, I would say, maybe like a quarter inch thick.
Yeah, and it's
From
95 pages.
Yeah, so and you know, a healthy amount of white space on the pages as well. So yeah, I would be curious. I'm not going to do that math right now because my brain will not allow me
No,
to. But yes, I would imagine this is rather short as well. Do you have off the top of your head a favorite passage from Blue?
I have a couple and they're
Please,
short.
please indulge me.
Okay. Okay, so on page 5, number 13, at a job interview at a university, 3 men sitting across from me at a table. On my CV, it says that I am currently working on a book about the color blue. I have been saying this for years without writing a word. It is perhaps my way of making my life feel in progress rather than a sleeve of ash falling off a lit cigarette. One of the men asks, "Why blue?" People ask me this question often. I never know how to respond. We don't get to choose what or whom we love, I want to say. We just don't get to choose. I love that one. And then another one, I think it's page 39. Yeah, page 39, number 104, about her friend who was in a car crash. I do not feel my friend's pain, but when I unintentionally cause her pain, I wince as if I hurt somewhere, and I do. Often in exhaustion, I lay my head down on her lap in her wheelchair and tell her how much I love her, that I'm so sorry she is in so much pain, pain I can witness and imagine, but that I do not know. She says, if anyone knows this pain besides me, it is you, and Jay, her lover. This is generous, for to be close to her pain has always felt like a privilege to me, even though pain could be defined as that which we typically aim to avoid. Perhaps this is because she remains so generous within hers, and because she has never held any hierarchy of grief, either before her accident or after, which seems to me nothing less than a form of enlightenment. So I love those ones.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I also just loved so much in Blue the way she weaves in her friend who has been in the accident, and relating that pain. I just think that's such a brilliant idea because Maggie Nelson's pain is so internal and emotional, and so I just think it's so interesting to then have the juxtaposition of this physical pain in her friend and this life altering accident she's been in. And then the caretaking too is so beautiful. And, when she's saying it's a privilege to help her friend and like just, to share her pain. And I think that's so beautiful too.
Right. And, I didn't consider the interiority versus the exteriority. I think because I was rereading this in the context of, okay, talking about Lexi's book as well. I was thinking so much about, the relationship she mourns. I'm sure there's a tenderness to it, a romantic tenderness. But it seems like a lot of that romance is physical. But I would say that there's also like a romantic friendship. There is a love, like a deep love that she has for this friend. And I think that holding that up against this person that she misses being with, but may
Yeah.
have been more well, actually, that in its own way is exterior, interior. We have superficial relationships that we love and we miss. And then we also have ones that go deeper below the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm like, as I was preparing for this, I was like, oh my gosh, people have probably written like multiple doctoral dissertations on Blue A. Like, why am I even attempting to contribute to the conversation from my
I know,
tiny
me
little
too.
corner of the world?
When I was using it as a comp title to try to sell the book, or like, because I submitted to agents and publishers, like I did everything and got so many million rejections. But when I was like putting together my query letter and trying to figure out that whole process, I'd never done it before, and so I like learned about comp titles, which I had never known before.
Yeah.
And this was the first one I wanted to put, but I was like, is that like so egotistical? Like, how can I even think this is a comp? It's just like this whole mental game you get into of like, what do I put down that doesn't seem like a total egotistical thing? Like, I don't think I'm anywhere near the realm of this, but it's like something that informed me or like inspired me. And it's this funny thing to try to come up with. That was the part I struggled with so much. I'm sure other people do too, but
Oh
like
yeah.
that was the hardest part for me of the query letter. Oh
Especially
God.
if you're doing something somewhat new, it can be very
Mhm.
difficult to find comp titles because you want to show them that you know the market. That's always so
Right.
important. But at the same time, like, okay, I'm doing something new with plot or form or something. It hasn't been done before, but do I sound like an asshole if I don't have
Yes.
comp titles?
Exactly. Oh my God, totally. It's so funny. And
Yeah.
I've seen like I definitely searched for like examples of bad query letters because I was like, I don't I want to make sure I don't end up in those. And so I like made sure to not do any of those
Yeah.
horrible things. But yeah, it was so funny.
On a complete side note, can I ask, are you unagented or so did you broker your deal with rejection letters by yourself? That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Good
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
you.
No agent, and yeah, just me and my publisher, DT, and he's doing it all on his own too. So it's like it's nice to have a partner in crime. We both, so like this is the first book on his press. He's had
Oh, wow.
this like lit mag, but
Mhm.
this is the first book on his press, and so it's really fun. And he's had his own books published, and then he has self-published some books, so he definitely had experience like as an
Yes.
author being published, and then also with just like the mechanics of it.
Mhm.
But because it's like the first book on his press and it's my first book, it was like, I don't know, I felt so lucky because we're such partners in crime, and it's just the two of us, and we're just like have been working our asses off on it.
That's incredible.
Yeah, but
And I
yeah,
mean,
no
like,
agent
I
or
think
anything
it's
like that.
paying, like, from what I can see, it's paying off. So, like, that's fantastic.
I'm also so lucky that I have like amazing writer friends who have been so
Yes.
helpful with like their connections and like putting me in touch with different people, or like hyping up my book, and then people see it or whatever. So I feel very lucky about that too. It's not just DT and me when I think about it. It's like my whole
Right.
community too.
It's the whole village, right?
Yes, exactly.
Um, well, so okay, I did want to, sorry, I'm so bad at transitions sometimes. I'm like, yeah, that was a great little tangent. Now how do I get back on track?
No, I totally get it. Me too.
Um, there's this section, one of my favorites, and that'll transition me into what I wanted to talk about next. Um, where she's speaking of how we get used to, you don't want to view the entire world through one glass bead. You want the entire palette of color. And her number 79 proposition says, for just because one loves blue does not mean that one wants to spend one's life in a world made of it. Life is a train of moods like a string of beads, and as we pass through them, they prove to be many colored lenses which paint the world their own hue, and each shows only what lies in its focus. wrote Emerson. To find oneself trapped in any one bead, no matter what its hue, can be deadly. I was rereading this book up in the mountains of North Carolina, which, as someone who has lived the past decade in the flatlands of North Florida, was just paradise, and like to feel the fall breeze on my face and everything. One day we were driving back to the cabin from a hike. It takes forever to get anywhere up there because of how twisty the roads are. And I observed to my husband, I was like, how long do you think it would take to get used to it? Like if you lived up here? Because it's gorgeous, but we're new to it. And he was like, I don't know, how long do you think it would take? I said, maybe like 2 weeks to a month. And he was like, I think it would take like a week. It's wild how fast we get used to beauty, like the things that we take for granted. And that made me start thinking about the nurturing and the getting some spark of joy out of being there for other people. And then also the ways that unfortunately that can be manipulated against people. So I wondered, in this lens of Maggie Nelson, do you think that Daniel and possibly Leo, like they got used to the color that was Lexi? And do you think Lexi feels that way about what happened with the fallout with the two men?
Yes, I love that question. I love that passage too. It's so brilliant. I think, yeah, I think both Daniel and Leo really got used to being in that color bead. And I think that Lexi did, but then like you were saying earlier, it's like then she started to crave a different color, but wanted to be able to go back to that one whenever she wanted to. And that's a hard dynamic. Like I don't think you can really change a relationship dynamic. Once it's set up, it's really hard to change. And so I don't think you can go from the blue bead to the purple bead. You might need to be in one that's swirled, that's both, or like, a multicolored bead.
Right. So
But
choose
it's
your
got to
beads
be like
wisely.
that. Exactly. But it has to be to start. I think it's too hard to change it. It's,
Yeah.
If you're on the receiving end of that nurturing, you might see that as a rejection of you, or that the person is resenting you or sick of you or whatever. And then as the nurturer, it's like, this is how I get value, is by taking care of someone. So how do I get value if I'm not doing that? So yeah, it's a trick. I mean, I think it's a losing prospect, really.
Right.
And it's why I have been in therapy about this for a long time now.
I find myself with new people that I like, new friends I'm meeting in the last couple of years, that I've been working on this, like, I call it being a people pleaser in recovery.
I love that.
Thank you. Trying to really, because it's like an addiction, like you want to help these people. Like you cannot physically not want to help, but some people, A, do not want your help and will be frustrated if you try to give it. And then B, just like, most of my friends have known me since time immemorial. So it's nice to kind of experiment and go, okay, as a 30-something woman, how do people perceive me if I set up those boundaries? Like, can this be a more equivalent and more equal sort of relationship? And I always feel so awful when I like feel myself ceding ground. I'm like, oh, great. Okay, we're going back to where we were.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I relate so strongly. And it's so funny because I don't ever think that about other people. I never think like, oh, she's not being nurturing. Like I never think that, it's so funny to think that about ourselves, but I don't ever think that about someone else. So it's funny to have this self-judgment when there's not actually any external judgment. You just,
Yeah.
Are used to something.
Although I think a lot of us, especially writers, we tend to have that inner critic. So
very true. Yeah, our inner critics are extremely loud.
Yes. Yes. All right, I've got a few more questions that I wanted to get through. I think people must have been following all of your stuff. Like they know the Lexi Kent-Monning American Songbook. So we sort of went over that, but I did want to speak about interiority a bit more deeply, and bear with me because I had a lot of feelings and a lot of thoughts about this.
Great, let's do it.
Okay. So at one point, I believe it's in number 187, Nelson writes, "Is it a related form of self-aggrandizement to inflate a heartbreak into a sort of allegory?" And she seems to express here and in other places throughout the collection some, if I can dare to like armchair psychiatrist for her, some nervousness for her project. Like she seems to hide behind blue, whereas in your novel, Lexi is on full display. Like even when she's hiding from the neighbors in her crying place, the one spot in her house in Big Sur where like the windows don't hit, she's telling the reader, so she's not hiding from someone in that moment. And there's also like I noticed, especially the deeper I got into my reread of Blue, Nelson seems to hide behind a veil, not of unknowing, because that's something she explores, as like mystics have said, that like undoing your knowing is the path to enlightenment, something she seems to struggle with. But she seems to almost like hide behind this veil of, I don't know. You know, like I don't know how I would change. I don't know how to unpack everything I'm feeling, which feels to me as I was reading it, God, okay, so it was published in 2009, 14 years after the fact, feels a bit ineffable for today's writing landscape. Like, since she published this book, there was that huge wave of personal essays, like to the point where there were thought pieces like, how much is too much sharing in personal essays? Like there was that whole zeitgeist that led to, I mean, admittedly fantastic essayists like Gia Tolentino and a lot of other folks from Hairpin. Um, but anyway, I was just curious. Like I said, maybe it just comes down to when she was writing, but did you ever have similar feelings as you were writing The Burden of Joy, that some sense of nervousness or desire to not know rather than like plumb the depths of the argument you were trying to make?
Yeah, I really went back and forth on that. And it kind of changed draft to draft, and also honestly kind of changed depending on what was happening in therapy and like just in my life, you know. I really, and then it, I think some places, I don't know, I think I kind of felt like the trick that I found was I could be really forthcoming and say everything about certain things that maybe other people wouldn't. And then because I did that, I could be more ambiguous about other things that are maybe a little more internal, or you know, just kind of be indecisive about stuff where I felt like if I wasn't so bold in certain places that I wouldn't maybe be able to get away with that. So it was definitely a balance I had to strike, and it's also a balance I have to strike just in my daily life, because I'm used to writing so like, you know, no holds barred, that I'm like, oh right, that's something I can like write about and craft something about it, but like I probably shouldn't just be like that on the daily, you know, like I don't want to be a chronic oversharer. Like I've got to channel it into this thing that I do.
When you figure out how to do that, can you please share your seat? I will pay you good money. Because I think that is one way that I try to get in, like with other people. It's like an emotional shorthand. If I tell you everything I'm feeling and like some of my dirtiest traumas, like then you're going to let me into your inner circle, you know?
Totally. I do that so much. That's completely one of my like reasons for doing it too, is like I want to show you that I trust you and that like I like you and that we can totally be friends. Like here's this big thing, you know.
Yeah.
It's so funny. And it's actually been interesting to see now that my book has been out for a couple of weeks, like I'm definitely getting some emails and DMs and stuff with like people's like traumas, you
Oh
know.
my
It's
gosh.
like it's kind of interesting. I kind of thought that might happen. I've had some friends have books out that are like pretty personal, and
Mhm.
they've gotten those responses. So that's been really interesting, because I feel like it's such a I don't know, that's like such a huge thing that people are trusting me with to share
Yeah,
stuff. And like I take that very seriously, but I also am not, I don't know what I'm doing. So like I don't want to give anybody advice or, you know, anything like that. So that's
right.
been funny for me to try to navigate, is like, oh, now I'm getting that stuff. And usually I'm the one giving it. So that's been funny to figure out too, and like how to receive those things and how to respond. And I mean, you know, I'm so honored that people trust me with these pieces of information about their own lives, but I
Mhm.
also like, I don't know what I'm doing, so don't come to me for advice, guys, you know.
It's it sounds though like, you know, well, for one thing, you're a good guardian of those things. Like you're doing the right thing and figuring out how to respond to them rather than just like, oh my gosh, I guess I've got to, you know, respond to everything and, you know, but that's I think earlier I was talking about, you write something and there's something like an honesty, an emotional honesty that comes from the writer, and you just hope it reaches out and resonates with the reader. And I think that is sort of the recompense for it, like the reader reaching back out and going like, hey, I totally get this. And
Yeah,
it's
that's so
kind of cool in
true.
that way, that reciprocal, like no matter what else happens with my writing, my very first publication day, someone reached out and was like, I don't know if you meant to code your main character as neurodivergent, but I am. And I just felt like, I wanted to reach out. I was an early reader and I saw shades of myself in Beatrice. And I was like, it's so wild you say that, because I was going on this journey of like unmasking and realizing, my place in neurodiversity as I was writing this book over the decade that I wrote it. So it's just like that reciprocity is a beautiful part of the writing life that I don't think we expect when it
Yeah.
happens.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Wow, that's so meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like yours
Definitely.
has been as well. Absolutely. So
Yeah, it's I feel very lucky. And another thing I feel lucky about is that nobody has like sent me creepy, gross DMs, even though there's a bunch of sex in the book. So I'm
good.
hope knock on wood, I hope that stays. But
Fantastic.
like, and just like to bring it back to Maggie Nelson, one of the things that I was so taken by with her was that she talks about having sex on like what, the fourth page or something. And I
Yeah.
was like, whoa, like I didn't know you could do that. Like, and so like that really emboldened me to turn that up in my book too, and to feel comfortable doing that. Is like, I think seeing a woman write like that and like having it be kind of matter of fact,
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, like this, you can do this, like
And
holy shit.
and she comes from I mean, you're now part of that tradition. She references, gosh, I'm forgetting the author's name, but it's from like the
Oh,
early
the
2000s, the sex memoir.
yeah, the Diary of Catherine M or something like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's it. That's it.
Yeah, I haven't, Catherine M I know is the thing, I forget what the rest of it is.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's like a French art critic who just was like, I'm going to write about my penchant for group sex and I'm not going to shy away from it, like, and also
Exactly.
a woman doing that. So, yeah, no, I'm so glad though that you have not gotten any creepy DMs like
Yeah,
that.
let's hope that maintains.
Keep it that way. Um, well, is there anything we haven't talked about with Maggie Nelson that you would like to say?
I just love this book so much, and I think that it's so interesting to me to see how it resonates for such different people in such different ways. And it's one that I just recommend to people all the time, because I feel like I've recommended it to people of like all ages, all genders, like all races, and each person is like just so taken with it in a way that I was too. And so I'm always excited when somebody else is, but it has also been like such a delightful surprise to see what it is that resonates with people about it. And I like basically have friendships that have formed because of this book.
Oh, that's so
So
cool. Really?
yeah, it's so awesome. And also one friend, I won't say, one friend of mine was like, oh no, I can't read that book because this creepy guy sent it to me when he was like obsessed with me. And I was like, oh, he used Maggie Nelson for evil. I was like so upset. So it's
Never
so
use Maggie
funny how people have such
that.
different experiences with it. But yeah, I mean, it's one that even if you don't think it's for you, it's one I still recommend so highly, because I don't know, it's funny, it's almost like a Ouija board of like what someone's going to get out of it, and like each time I read it I get something different too. So yeah, I just think it's such an interesting thing, and I think it's a good way to like get to know somebody who's like, give this to them and see what they think.
Yeah. Ooh, it's your litmus test.
Yes,
The Maggie
exactly.
Nelson litmus test. That's so cool. Well, I've
Yeah.
just really enjoyed having the excuse to reread it. And you're right, like reading it at different points in your life. That's true of most books that are worth their salt. But just, I love what you said, calling it like a Ouija board. It's like you're getting a message from the spirit realm, going back in there and
Yeah.
trying it out. So, well, okay. So I love this question and I hate this question. I have to close out by looking forward, but I
Mhm.
also just feel like there's such a push for the next thing these days. So I'm going to ask it slightly differently. Are you giving yourself time to bask in the glow of the awesome reception that The Burden of Joy has gotten so far? Or are you already looking towards what's next? And I hope the answer is both. I hope you're giving yourself time to just soak it all in.
It is totally both. And I also love the way you frame this question. So it's been so nice to like get to focus on it. And I took a week off of work to do some like readings and travel a little bit to do some readings. And that kind of forces you to be in the moment, like, you know, when you're in places that aren't your home or you're, you know, wherever you live. So that kind of forced me into really being present with it. And that was so fun. I am also, it's funny, like since it has come out, I've gotten some opportunities I didn't think would, I don't know, that I was not expecting. And
awesome.
so instead of focusing on like the next thing that I had in mind, now I'm getting to like look at other stuff that I never even knew existed a week ago or whatever, you know. So that, and those are smaller things, but that's been really a surprise. And it's been really fun to see like that people who have read it or maybe are like, you know, learning about it or whatever for the first time, that it inspires them to ask me to, you know, like solicit me for some like a review or some other piece of writing, and that I would not have necessarily thought to do myself. So that's cool. And those are smaller things, which is, you know, what I love to do in between big things. So
Right.
I think that will also force me to kind of like stay in the moment a little bit more if I'm not just like moving to another big project next. But I do have a first draft of a next manuscript. So
Ooh,
there is
exciting.
also a longer thing that like is in the future, but
Well, that's awesome. Where can listeners or watchers of this conversation follow you so that they know about the big and the small things that are coming up for Lexi Kent-Monning?
yes, thank you. I am at Lexicola, Lexicola on Twitter and Instagram. And then my website, which I'm like pretty good at updating, is lexikentmonning.com.
I've been like looking at your author website and taking notes. I'm like, this is an author website. Just Italian chef kiss. Mine is like, I love her, but she's a hot mess. Like,
Oh, thank you. I just try to keep it easy for myself, you know, and
yeah,
so I'm glad to hear you like it because I just want to make it easy to update and like nothing fancy, but
yeah.
also like show who I am a little bit, you know, so
Yeah, I
balance,
that's
but
how I learned about your art show that you had a couple of years
oh
ago.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's so
Thank
cool.
you. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for being in conversation with me. I'm so excited to say we're going to keep the literary and indie press train moving next month. I'm going to be in conversation with someone you know, Mila Jaroniak, the author of Plastic Vodka Bottles Sleepover and the creator of Black Lipstick. We'll be reading Valencia by Michelle Tay with her. So fun
Cool.
times, fun times.
Oh, everyone got to listen to that one. Mila is a brilliant genius and such a thoughtful person when it comes. Yeah, I absolutely love her so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, she's
Yeah.
fantastic. Can't say enough good things about either of you. Lexi, thank you so so much one last time for
Thank
being here.
you. This has been so fun. I've been so looking forward to it. And this was just such a blast. And it was so fun to get to reread this book too. And thank you for your support. I'm so glad that we're part of the same writing community. I feel so lucky. And I
Oh,
just am so
thank you.
grateful that I got this chance. It was so fun to think about my book in this context. So thank you
Oh
so
my gosh.
much.
Thank you, Lexi. Have a good
Thank
night, okay?
you. You too. Thanks everybody for coming.
All right.
Bye.